Ever get that feeling like when something just doesn't quite add up?
Oh, yeah, totally. Like you're looking at all the pieces, but something's missing.
Exactly. And today's topic is a prime example. We're talking about China's economic boom.
Which is, on the surface, incredible, right? I mean, the growth, the sheer
Yeah.
speed of it.
Right. But then you get to the corruption side of things, and it's like, wait a minute.
Because conventionally, you don't see that kind of growth with that level of corruption.
It's almost like they're breaking the rules of the game and still winning. So, to try and understand this head-scratcher, we're diving into China's Gilded Age by Yuen Yuen Ang.
Great book. And Ang really challenges this idea that corruption is just one thing, you know?
Yeah, because most of us, we hear corruption and it's automatically a bad thing.
Right, exactly. But she makes this point is way more complicated than that.
Okay, so break it down for us. What's the nuance here?
Well, she argues that there are different types of corruption, and they actually have different impacts on an economy.
So, like, not all corruption is created equal. You got your good corruption and your bad corruption.
It's not about good and bad, but more like different flavors, let's say. And some are definitely worse than others.
Right.
Like, imagine you've got a spectrum, right?
Okay, I'm picturing it.
So on one end, the most basic kind, you've got just straight up theft. Someone in government taking money for themselves.
A classic, lining their own pockets.
Exactly. And that, well, that's pretty damaging to an economy, right?
Stealing resources, undermining trust. Yeah, not great.
Now, on the other end of the spectrum, you have what Ang calls speed money.
Speed money. Okay, I've never heard of that one.
It's more common than you might think. It's like small bribes that people pay to, grease the wheels.
To cut through red tape and get things done faster.
Exactly. And this one, it's kind of a mixed bag, right? It's not ideal, but...
It's not as obviously harmful as just stealing a bunch of money.
Right. It can even, in a weird way, make things more efficient, but...
But it still undermines fairness, right? The little guy who can't afford to pay extra is at a disadvantage.
Exactly. And then you've got this other category, smack dab in the middle, that Ang calls access money. And this is where China gets really interesting.
Access money, what is that?
So imagine a big company wants a government contract, a really lucrative one. Instead of competing fairly, they bribe officials to make sure they get it.
Ah, so they're buying their way to the front of the line.
Exactly. And this access money, it can fuel growth in the short term, but it creates all these distortions in the market.
Because you're favoring certain players, stifling competition.
And in the long run, that can be really damaging.
So we've got these different types of corruption, each with its own quirks and consequences, but where does China fit into all of this? I mean, which flavor did they go for?
Well, according to Ang, access money has been kind of their secret sauce.
Wow. Okay, so they've built this economic powerhouse on a foundation of bribery. That's a bold strategy, but the million-dollar question is why? Why would they go down this path, and how have they managed to make it work, at least for a while?
Now, those are the million-dollar questions, aren't they? And to understand the why, we've got to dig into how China's system is actually structured, because it's quite different from what we might be used to in other parts of the world.
So last time, we were talking about how China has used access money, this sort of strategic bribery, to fuel its insane economic growth.
Yeah, and it really does seem like it's been kind of a key ingredient in their recipe for success, at least up to this point.
But it still leaves us with this big, kind of uncomfortable question. Why? Why would they choose this path?
One of the things Aang points to is incentives.
Incentives.
Yeah, you see, in China, when the economy grows, everyone benefits. From the top officials down to the local bureaucrats. It's kind of like this rising tide lifts all boats situation.
So it's in everyone's best interest to keep the economic engine running, even if it requires a bit of, shall we say, creative rule bending.
You got it.
Yeah.
But here's where it gets really interesting, because even with this access money system, they still have some rules.
Wait, so it's not just a complete free-for-all. There's some method to the madness.
Oh, absolutely. It's kind of like, imagine a gardener pruning a tree, right?
Okay, I'm following.
They're not chopping the whole thing down. They're just strategically getting rid of the dead branches to help the healthy ones thrive.
So they're managing the corruption, trying to keep the good kind, if you can even call it that, while reining in the more destructive types.
Exactly. And there's actually evidence that this is happening. Ang's research, she found that while bribery in general has increased in China, more blatant forms of corruption, things like just straight-up embezzlement, that's actually gone down since the 2000s.
So they're making an effort to, like, channel the corruption, make it less, I don't know, openly damaging.
That's the idea. And it's a delicate balancing act. And this is where another fascinating element comes in. Regional competition?
Right, because China's not exactly known for its vibrant democratic elections at the national level.
Exactly. But what they do have is fierce competition between different provinces and regions.
So it's like a giant economic Hunger Games. Everyone's fighting for a piece of the pie.
In a way, yeah.
Yeah.
And this creates a huge incentive for local leaders to keep the more predatory types of corruption under control because they want to attract investment, right? So they have to at least appear to be competent and in control.
It's a tightrope walk for sure, needing that access money to keep the growth going, but not letting it get so out of hand that it scares investors away.
Exactly. It's a fascinating paradox. And it actually reminds me a bit of another country that went through a similar phase, the United States, during its Gilded Age in the late 19th century.
Oh, wow. Didn't see that comparison coming. Tell me more.
Well, you had this period of just explosive economic growth, fueled by, you guessed it, lots of corruption. Robber barons, political patronage, insider trading. It was a wild time.
Sounds familiar. So is China just retracing America's footsteps? Will they eventually clean things up like the U.S. did?
It's tempting to think that, but it's probably not that straightforward. See, the U.S. back then, they had a more established democratic process, a free press that could expose corruption, and, crucially, the ability to vote corrupt officials out of office.
Which, as a one-party state, China doesn't really have.
Exactly. So while the parallels are definitely there, the outcomes could be very, very different. And this is where Xi Jinping's anti-corruption crackdown adds a whole other layer of complexity to this story.
Right. Because even though we've been talking about how China has kind of embraced certain forms of corruption, Xi Jinping has really made fighting corruption a signature part of his time in power.
He has, and it's been fascinating to watch. Because instead of taking this kind of institutional bottom-up approach, he's gone very top-down, really making it a central focus of the Communist Party. It's a bold move, and whether it'll actually work in the long term is a question that's still very much up in the air.
So we spent this whole time talking about how China's used access money to, well, basically supercharge their economic growth. But it's obviously a risky strategy, right?
Oh, absolutely. And Ang, she really zeroes in on this idea that China's kind of facing this reckoning.
Like they've been riding this wave, but now they've got to figure out how to, I don't know, get off before it crashes.
Exactly. And she highlights a few big challenges they're dealing with. One is overinvestment, especially in certain sectors. They've poured a ton of money into things like infrastructure, real estate.
Which, on the surface, doesn't sound so bad. I mean, who doesn't love a shiny new bridge?
Right, but if you build too many bridges and nobody's driving on them, well, and then there's the whole debt bubble issue.
Right, because all that investment has got to be funded somehow.
Exactly.
Yeah.
And a lot of it has been done through borrowing. So now they're sitting on this mountain of debt, and if the economy slows down, things could get, well, let's just say it could get messy.
So it's like this weird balancing act. They need to keep the economy growing to manage that debt, but the way they've been growing is inherently unsustainable and kind of built on this foundation of, well, questionable practices.
It's a tough spot to be in, for sure. And remember, all of this is happening against the backdrop of, global uncertainty. You've got the trade tensions with the U.S., which aren't going away anytime soon, and the world economy is a pretty unpredictable place these days.
Right, so no easy answers for China. But let's say, hypothetically, they want to get off this access money treadmill. What would that even look like? Is there a way to unwind this system without completely tanking the economy?
That's the billion-dollar question, isn't it? And I don't think anyone has a perfect answer, but I think what Ang makes really clear is that something has to change. This whole growth model that's gotten them this far, it's probably not going to cut it in the long run, especially if they care about things like, stability and reducing inequality.
Right, because even if this access money thing has worked, economically speaking, at least for a while, it's not exactly a recipe for a happy, equitable society when you've got this small group of people hoarding all the wealth and power, right?
Exactly. And that's where Xi Jinping's anti-corruption campaign, it's such a wild card.
Yeah.
Can he actually use this top-down approach to, clean up the system from within? Or is he just shifting the deck chairs on the Titanic? I don't think anyone knows, but it's going to be fascinating to watch.
It's definitely got me thinking because, we started this whole conversation talking about how China's kind of an outlier, right? This country with tons of corruption that somehow managed to defy the odds. But the more we talk about it, the more I wonder if they're really that different from other parts of the world, just maybe on a bigger, more intense scale.
It makes you think, doesn't it?
Yeah.
Like maybe access money or something like it is happening everywhere, just not always is out in the open. Food for thought for sure.
Definitely a lot to chew on. Well, that's about all the time we have for today's deep dive. Big thanks to our expert for breaking it all down and to all of you for listening. We'll be back next time with another topic that's sure to challenge your assumptions and leave you wanting more. See you then.